Hey everyone, it's Katie, your friendly neighborhood public health nerd. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the intersection of racism in the fields of science and medicine. We'll begin with a deep dive into the origins of racist scientific theory, and then we'll be heading to the 1800s and 1900s. Lastly, we'll be taking a moment to reflect on how racism still impacts these fields in the 21st century. I've used a variety of different sources for today's video, so if you're interested in reading more, take a look at the links in the description down below. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, we'll have to start by talking about Aristotle, aka one of the most famous Greek philosophers of all time. When it comes to race, Aristotle and other philosophers of his time pushed different theories about why people from Africa were supposedly inferior. Aristotle wrote that people in warm climates were wanting in spirit, and therefore they are always in a state of subjection and slavery. Yikes. In other words, he argued that people from Africa and warmer climates were destined to be slaves from the get-go. And Aristotle wasn't alone. Hippocrates, whose name might be familiar to some of you, also claimed that people from Africa couldn't possibly be creative, because they lived in environments that were just too hot for creativity. Looking back at this now, these claims are definitely out there. But when countries and empires began colonizing Africa and enslaving Africans, they cited these philosophers to back them up. These theories, when combined, are known as climate determinism, or in some cases, climate theory. There was also polygenesis, which is the theory that different races originated from different backgrounds and sources. This theory has been disproven by modern science many times, but just like climate determinism, polygenesis was often used as justification for racist practices and slavery around the world. In the early 1800s, German physiologist Franz Joseph Gall came up with the idea that the shape of someone's skull could determine factors like intelligence, creativity, and other mental capabilities. These studies are called phrenology, and they're considered as pseudoscience by today's scientific standards. In other words, they're fake. With that said, people around the world used phrenology to justify that white people are supposedly superior to everyone else. Phrenology was used to argue that Africans were the least evolved because their skulls were the most similar to those of our primate ancestors. As the US neared the Civil War, in an effort to justify slavery practices, physicians argued that the shapes of African people's skulls made them the most tameable and best suited for slaves. While phrenology continued to spread, modern medicine and health research was advancing at rapid rates. In the field of gynecology, J. Marion Sims was pioneering research in female reproductive health and treatment. He's often considered the father of gynecology, and he contributed greatly to this field. However, in order to conduct his research, he experimented on slave women without their consent, and mostly without using anesthesia. Ew. And on top of that, it wasn't until he had perfected his treatment plans on slave women without using anesthesia that he would go and then treat white women for the same diseases, this time using anesthesia. Perhaps this stemmed from the racist misconception that black people had higher pain tolerances than all other races. This, like polygenesis and climate determinism, was a far-reaching assumption made in the medical field, and its influence has continued to persist today, as you'll see in the later section. Now, although slavery might have been abolished by the turn of the 20th century, racist practices in medicine certainly did not stop there. Now, perhaps one of the most infamous cases of this was the Tuskegee syphilis study. Here's some context for you. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service recruited 600 African American males to participate in a study of syphilis, which at the time had no cure and was spreading rapidly. In exchange, the participants were offered free medical care. Out of the 600 participants, 399 of them had latent syphilis, and the other 201 didn't carry the disease at all. Over the next 40 years, the participants' health was monitored as their disease progressed and spread throughout the community. However, despite being promised health treatment, the participants were only given placebos, because the researchers wanted to track the full progression of syphilis without treatment. Because of this, even though physicians began treating syphilis patients with penicillin in 1947, the study participants didn't receive this treatment and continued to suffer. By the time the study was shut down in 1972 due to public outcry, syphilis had already claimed the lives of many participants and had spread to their spouses and children, which was often fatal. The Tuskegee syphilis study is now considered one of the biggest bioethics violations in all of modern American history. But of course, it certainly was not the last time that the pervasiveness of racism found its way into science and medicine. For those of us who are familiar with the biomedical field, we have, without a doubt, come across HeLa cells at least once in our lifetimes. In fact, one of my first lab experiences was looking at HeLa cells under a microscope in my junior year cellular physiology class. However, the origins of HeLa cells are often overlooked. They come from Henrietta Lacks, who was a black woman who died at the age of 31 in 1951 from cervical cancer. While she was being treated at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, her physicians took samples of her cervical cells, which they gave to researchers. Without her consent. Yeah. The researchers then discovered that Lax's cells divided extremely rapidly, making them extremely useful in the field of biomedical research. Her cells were distributed widely, her name was broadcasted, her medical records were published, and her genome was even uploaded online. All of this was done without her consent, nor the consent of her descendants. Yeah. Now, while her descendants are glad to see that HeLa cells are being used for the advancement of medicine in a positive way, we still must acknowledge the fact that Lax's cells were unfairly being spread without her consent. Once again, the case of HeLa cells adds to a long list of injustices against Black people within the medical system and scientific research. In 2023, we're still far from achieving racial equality within medicine and science. Within the medical field, many practitioners still believe that Black people have intrinsically higher pain tolerances, or are much more likely to exaggerate their pain levels. This is especially true for Black women, such as in the case of maternal and infant mortality in the US. In a recent report from the CDC, federal data showed that in 2021, the rate of maternal death in Black women was twice that of white women. Recently, in 2017, a nursing textbook was pulled after the public began criticizing it for categorizing pain responses from different races. For example, the textbook claimed that Black people report higher pain intensity than other cultures, among other unfounded generalizations about other races. Whew, that was a lot of stuff. So, with that, we conclude a very, very brief overview of racism in the fields of science and medicine. I hope you all learned something today, or are at least more conscientious of how pervasive racism can be, and how long-lasting its impact is. Once again, if you're interested in learning more, I'd recommend checking out any of the links in the sources down below. So with that, happy learning everyone, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!